sang this song because we're going to talk about our awareness of God. We're going to talk about our God consciousness and how we need to be aware of when He walks in the room and the things that'll fall away. So God, I thank you for this testimony. God, we just declare that we're going to hear from you this morning. Pray that you would open our ears and our hearts to receive revelation of your goodness, God, and the things that you have in store for us. Amen. As you can see, Jeff and Helen aren't here this Sunday, so I'm going to fill in for Jeff this morning. So that's fun. I can't see any of you. I don't actually know if anybody's here. Just fighting a little bit of a cold. It's trying to grab its grip, so I have my tea, and so if you just give me grace in that. I tried to save my voice through worship, but it was just so good. I just had to belt it out. So as I was preparing for this morning, I was, God just kept bringing me back to some of the things that He's been bringing up in my life and the types of revelation He's been giving me and the words that we've been receiving and things like that. And one that I kept going back to was when God gave me a word to share, and it was a vision. And I don't know if you were here in early January, if you remember it, but what I saw was dry ground. And on the top, there wasn't much going on. There wasn't a lot of growth happening. There wasn't a lot of breakthrough and spurts of new life. But then God showed me below the surface, and that roots were just trenching in. They were digging in, and they were spreading deep, and they were spreading wide, and they were going towards streams of living water, where we would be constantly satisfied, where we would be so rooted in that no matter what came against us, no matter what circumstance came against us, that we would be strong oaks planted by these mighty streams. And I felt the Lord saying not to be discouraged with what we see happening on the surface, but to be encouraged that He was rooting us in, and that we were going to have the root system necessary to shoot to heights that we'd never ever seen before in Him. And so I kept coming back to this, and I don't know if it's my middle years teacher brain, but when I hear from God about that kind of stuff, I have to be like, well, what does that practically look like? What does that look like to dig in? What does that look like when you're digging us in and you're rooting us in, God? Because I want to know how that looks like in my day-to-day life. And He brought me back to this phrase, this strengthen yourself in the Lord. And we can see that in 1 Samuel 30, verse 6. And David was greatly distressed, for the people spoke of stoning him, because all the people were bitter in soul, each for his sons and daughters. But David strengthened himself in the Lord his God. And I love that phrase. But then it got me asking, what does that look like, God? What does that look like to strengthen ourselves in the Lord? What does that look like in my day-to-day? And now, women who come to Ladies Connection, you're going to have to forgive me because I've kind of taken some of the stuff I spoke on in January, and I just couldn't get away from it, and I felt like it really needed to be shared this morning. But when I think of David, that's one of the things I think of him in, is that he was always able to strengthen himself in the Lord, that no matter what things came his way, Oh, thank you. Good job. I'm like, key? What key? Good. All right. Crisis averted. Okay. When I think of David, one of the things I think of is how he was able to strengthen himself. Things would come his way, and we see in the Psalms that he'd be crying out to God like, why does everybody hate me? Why is everybody trying to kill me? But he would get to that place where he could always come back to that right perspective and see what God had for him, and to see his promises and strengthen himself in the Lord. And, David was also known as an extravagant worshiper. He was someone who was known as someone who was a man after God's own heart. he danced in the streets, and even his own wife was embarrassed of him in his worship. Okay? And I think that worship and that strengthening yourself in the Lord are a lot more connected than we sometimes realize. Our ability to connect with what God is doing in the midst of difficult circumstances depends on our ability to remember who he is and what he has done in our lives. So we're going to look at a passage where we're going to see that strength directly connected to remembering. And that's in Joshua chapter 1. We're going to read verses 1 through 9. Now it happened after the death of Moses, the servant of the Lord, that the Lord spoke to Joshua the son of Nun, Moses' servant attendant, saying, Moses my servant is now dead. Now therefore arise to take his place, cross over this Jordan, you and all this people, into the land which I am giving to them, to the sons of Israel. I have given you every place on which the sole of your foot treads, just as I promised to Moses. From the wilderness of the Arabia in the south, and this Lebanon in the north, and as far as the great river, the river Euphrates in the east, and the land of the Hittites, Canaan, and as far as the great Mediterranean Sea, toward the west shall be your territory. No man will be able to stand before you to oppose you as long as you live. Just as I was present with Moses, so I will be with you. I will not fail you or abandon you. Be strong and confident and courageous, for you will give this people as an inheritance the land which I swore to their fathers to give them. Only be strong and very courageous. Be careful to do everything in accordance with the entire law, which Moses my servant commanded you. Do not turn from it from the right or to the right or to the left, so that you may prosper and be successful wherever you go. This book of the law shall not depart from your mouth, but you shall read and meditate on it day and night, so that you may be careful to do everything in accordance with all that is written in it. For then you will make your way prosperous, and you will be successful. Have I not commanded you? Be strong and courageous. Do not be dismayed, terrified, or intimidated, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go. It's a lot more work now. Okay, so to put this in context, Moses has died. The Israelites were not allowed to enter the promised land. Now everybody who has died, including Moses, who was kept from the promised land, is now gone, and God says, all right, Joshua, step up. I want you to lead Israel into the promised land. 3 times he tells them, just in that short passage, be strong, be very courageous. Okay? Now, typically if someone says, don't be afraid, there's something to be afraid of. Am I right? So they're going into this land there was no eviction notice, from the landlord. This is an occupied land. It's full of people who want to keep their homes. Okay? They need to go in and they need to take the promised land. So God says, be strong, be courageous. Don't be afraid. He had an answer for that. He said, this book of the law shall not depart from your mouth. Meditate on it day and night. Don't go to the left. Don't go to the right. Stay on this. Now, sometimes I think the word law, there's a bug, I gotta kill it. Sometimes I think the word law gets a bad rap. We've kind of made it a bit of a dirty word, right? We feel like it's religious and all these things. But if we look at what the law was at that point, when this was written, the law was the first 5 books of the Bible. The law was Israel's entire history with God. That's what God said to meditate on. Meditate on my entire history with you. Meditate on every single thing I have done for you, on every interaction we've had, on every way that I have provided for you and liberated you. You need to meditate on those things, and you will be strong, and you will be courageous, and you will be prosperous and successful. The first 5 books of the Bible, the entire Bible, and we get the whole thing now, is testimony. It is what God has done for his people. When we meditate on that, when we meditate on all God has done, we can go in and we can take that promised land. We can do what God has called us to do. Now, we need to remember that this is the same promised land that they already tried to take at one point. They got as far as sending in the spies to check out the lay of the land. Okay, those 12 spies went in, and 10 of them came back with bad reports. They looked at the people. They're huge. They're like, nope. City was fortified. Nope. We're not going in there. They chose, even after seeing everything God had done, they chose to align themselves with fear and self-preservation rather than with the God who walked with them. And so these 10 men didn't just come back and keep it to themselves. They exaggerated it. They spoke lies. They just drummed up fear in the camp. And don't we see a parallel to that sometimes in our own culture? When people align with fear, myself included at times, people aren't content just to wallow in their own fear. They speak that fear. They exaggerate that fear. They want to get everybody else to join in on that fear. Okay? They convince others that God isn't big enough to handle what's going on in our lives. But he is. The result was that nobody who partnered with that fear got to enter the promised land. I think that's a whole other sermon in itself. So, we're on take 2 of Take the Promised Land. And Joshua, thankfully, was one of the spies who had a good report. He was like, yeah, it's big, yeah, they're big, they're fortified, but God is with us and we can take it because he told us to do it. Okay, so they set out and they've now sent spies in again. And they run into a little bit of trouble and Rahab shelters them and then, they come back and they're like, all right, it's good, let's go. So Joshua has 3 officers go throughout the camp and they say, when you see the Ark of the Covenant, you're going to get up and you're going to go after it. So that's their sign. That means we're moving on into the promised land. Promised land is when you see the Ark of the Covenant go out before you. Now the Ark is fascinating on its own. At one point in the Amplified Bible, and I don't know if I just never read this or just never really paid attention to it, but it's called the Ark of the Testimony, or the Ark of Testimony. And I think that's so cool. So I looked up in Hebrews 9, it describes the ark and its contents. In 9 verse 4, having the golden altar of incense and the Ark of the Covenant covered entirely with gold, this contained a golden jar which held the manna and the rod of Aaron that sprouted, and 2 stone tablets of the covenant inscribed with the 10 commandments. So we have this thing, this visual representation going out before them. And what did it hold? Everything represented the testimony of God. We had the tablets with the 10 commandments that represented a face-to-face encounter with God and God's interaction in their lives to lead them in the way that they should go. We have Aaron's rod, which was a part of so many of the miracles that God used to deliver them from Egypt. It was a testimony of how God delivered them from slavery. We have manna, which represented God's provision. When they had nothing, God provided daily manna for them. What's really cool about the ark is when we look at where did it travel. The ark always traveled 800 meters in front of the people. Why do you think that is? So they could see it. So that everywhere they went, no matter what battle God led them into, the testimony he set was always before them. He set his works and he called them to remember. As they moved forward, they weren't looking back, they were looking forward, and he set testimony before them. This is prophetic, church. This is what we need to do. This is how God has designed testimony to be a weapon and a tool in our life. Because when we set testimony, when we remember what God has done and what he has done for all the people around us, then we have the strength and courage to go forward into what he calls. Those two things, meditate on the law, the testimony, and that visual reminder of the testimony always going before you. So now he calls them, and they need to cross another river to get into the promised land. This time they have to cross the Jordan River. And God tells them to send out the ark into the river, and he's going to part the waters. Pretty simple. They had a lot of people. It wasn't just like a camp of a few people. I think it was closer to 1 million or more. What did God ask them to do? To position themselves. Go to the banks of the river, send out the ark, stand still. Did they have to strive? No. Did they have to swim? Nope. But they had to obey. They had to trust, and then God did the work. Do you notice that God didn't part the waters while they were still chilling out in camp? Being like, don't worry, waters are going to stay parted for about a week. Make your way leisurely across at your will. Send out a few spies. Make sure I actually did what I said I was going to do. No, he called them to obey. Come to the bank. I'm going to part those waters for you. Sometimes in our lives, we're back in camp. And we're waiting, and we're trying to see, and we're waiting for God to part the waters. But we don't want to go to the edge of the river. We need to get to the edge of the river, and we need to follow the ark. We need to set testimony before us. Now, I love Joshua. I think he's such a great leader because even before they cross the river, he talks to the leaders of the tribes, and he says, okay, I want you to gather up these stones, and we're going to carry them across, and I want you to place them as memorials to what God has done. God hadn't even done it yet. He's already thinking ahead. He's like, we got to get ready. We're going to remember this. So he tells them to get these rocks, and we're going to place them on the other side of the river so that when you come back here with your kids, they're going to ask, what are those rocks for? And you're going to say, oh, that was when God parted the rivers for us to take the promised land. He's already thinking ahead. He's already thanking God for what God's going to do. We need to live like that too. I also find it super interesting to look at the effect of testimony on the enemy. If you're opening your Bibles or swiping in your phones, we're going to swipe over to Joshua 5. And so this is after the waters have been parted. Now it happened when all the kings of the Amorites who were beyond the Jordan to the west, and all the kings of the Canaanites who were by the sea, heard that the Lord had dried up the waters of the Jordan before the Israelites until they crossed over, their hearts melted in despair, and there was no fighting spirit in them any longer because of the Israelites and what God had done for them. So if we look at that equation, we see the effect was they heard testimony of God, and their hearts melted in despair, and all the fighting spirit left from them. I'm going to go out on a limb and say that I imagine that that's how the enemy feels, how Satan feels when we declare our testimonies of God's goodness and his provision and his liberation in our lives. When we declare who he is, I think the enemy gets so deflated. I don't think anybody knows how defeated he is more than him. And when we speak out those testimonies and we declare God's goodness, I think he crumbles in despair. We're seeing a theme here. I'm going to keep going with the theme. They get into the desert, and before they go into their next battle, they stop, and now everyone who was born in the desert wasn't circumcised. So they stop and they circumcise all the men. Okay, it seems like an odd maybe detail to have in there, but what is circumcision? It's a physical reminder of God's covenant with Abraham. Okay, so as he's leading them into battle, as he's leading them towards Jericho, God stops them and says, wait a second, let's do another reminder here. Let's set up another thing. Let's remind you whose you are. He just keeps stopping them. Remember, remember, remember. In Psalm 119, verse 111, David declared, I have inherited your testimony forever. for they are the joy in my heart. The Hebrew root word for testimony is actually do again. I love that. It means do again. Just like how we talk about, I'm going to mess it up, so I won't say. But it's a good verse. I'll get it sometime. But every promise of God, every testimony, everything he's done for somebody else is a promise of what God will do for you. That's what the word means, to do again. That's why they had to call it to remembrance, because it means do again. And we get to be like David, who says, I have inherited your testimony forever. The Bible, the Word of God, that book full of testimony, that's our family history book. That's our legacy. We get to inherit that testimony just like David did. In Psalm 78, verses 5-7, it says, For he established a testimony, a specific precept in Jacob, and appointed a law in Israel, which he commanded our fathers, that they should teach to their children the great facts of God's transactions with Israel, that the generation to come might know them, and that the children still to be born may arise and recount them to their children, that they should place their confidence in God and not forget the works of God, but keep his commandments. There we see it again. God says, tell your children about this. You gotta talk about this all the time. In our house, we have a little book, and it has little mustaches on the front. But it's our miracle book. And in it, we write every single miracle that we have witnessed ourselves or been a part of. If I wrote down every one I've just heard in this church, it would be a whole nother book. But these are ones that we have specifically been a part of, that we have prayed for, that we have seen God do, that have happened in our own lives, our own bodies. And I love that my kids are starting to learn that when something happens, they're the ones to remind me. They're like, oh, can you write that in the miracle book? Yeah, of course I can. And we write it in the miracle book. And then we flip back and we remember, and remember this time? That was so cool. We need to talk about that all the time. And we need to not forget the works of God. Forgetting. I think that's something else, something that the Israelites were kind of known for. And I admit to being a little bit harsh about Israel sometimes, because I just want to say, Israel, you had one job. Just one. Okay? Like you had the God of the universe walking with you, fire by night, cloud by day, manna in the desert. You had one job. Just stop forgetting who he is and what he's done for you. And so as harsh as I am on Israel, I recognize that in my own life, where we freak out a little bit sometimes when we forget all that God has done and that he will do it again. After they defeat Jericho by positioning themselves and obeying, right, because they didn't have to do a whole lot besides obey. They walked around and they played some instruments and they yelled, and God made the walls fall down. So was it probably terrifying a little bit? Yeah, I'll give them that, but they just positioned themselves. And so afterwards, God says, okay, this stuff here that you took, don't take it for yourselves. Got it? Cool? And they're like, yeah. But then some of the people were like, they forgot who God was, and they decided to take it for themselves. And they're like, no biggie, I can take this. He's not going to know. They kind of forgot who God was. And so because of that disobedience, the next battle that they go into, they lose drastically. And they freak out. Why? Why, God? What are you doing? Why did you bring us here to die? Okay, and that's not the first time that they freaked out like that. I mean, we see it all the time. They're in the desert, they don't have food they like, and they're like, why? I'd rather go back to being a slave. And they freak out, and I see that in myself sometimes. Or I can see all the things that God has brought me through, and then I come up against a new circumstance, and I'm like, why? Why did you heal my body just to bring me into this health issue? Why did you, give us these financial blessings only now to take them away? Okay, and we freak out a little bit because we're not remembering who God is, and that there was never a promise of 0 circumstances coming up in our lives. God was continually leading them through battle, and they had to remember. And when they did, things went really, really well. And then when they didn't, they floundered for a while until they remembered. Psalm 78, verse 11 says, "And they forgot his incredible works and his miraculous wonders that he had shown them." Forgetting is a little more dangerous than we realize sometimes. But remembering is a tool. Remembering is a weapon and a tool for finding our strength in God. Testimonies caused the Israelites to set their hope in God. Bill Johnson says, "Our expectation of God is what determines our faith." I'll say that again. I think it's really good. Our expectation of God is what determines our faith. And most often, what we see is what we expect, right? If we've seen something, we'll expect it again. If we are constantly setting our mind on the negative, on the terrible news stories, on people's pain and suffering, we'll expect that. But we need to position ourselves for an invasion of God's power through faith. That faith enables us to do what God has called us to, just like it enabled the Israelites to do what they were called to do. This again is from Bill Johnson, just because it's a little easier just to read what he has to say. It's a little more eloquent than I would put it. But the final repetition, and he's talking about that passage in Joshua, the final repetition is the most significant because God makes a link between it and the promise. "Be strong and of good courage. Do not be afraid, nor be dismayed, for the Lord your God is with you wherever you go." Joshua 1:9. The truth he gave to Joshua and gives to us in this exhortation is simple, but profound. Our strength and courage to do what God has told us to do will flow directly from our awareness that God is with us. This truth further reveals how crucial our awareness of God's presence is. We need to be aware of God's presence because the issue has never been whether God is with us or not. It has always been whether we are aware of his presence or not, because he is always with us. It's just our awareness that changes, not his positioning. And I believe strongly in renewing our minds and learning to take thoughts captive and make them obedient to Christ. But I think another huge piece of the puzzle is learning and developing our God consciousness, our awareness of where he is and what he is doing at all times. Not everyone in Israel's camp got to have one-on-one conversations with God. We're really blessed to live on this side of the cross. They had to rely on testimony. They had to rely on what their leaders like Joshua said God was saying. And this truth carries over to this side of the cross. In Matthew 28, verse 20, we have Jesus talking here, and he's giving his last talk to the disciples. And he says, "Teaching them to observe everything that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, remaining with you perpetually, regardless of circumstance, and on every occasion, even to the very end of the age." That's Jesus. He says, "I am with you always, to the very end of the age." There's a little more Bill Johnson for you. Our connection with God, it's obviously the source of all blessing, prosperity, and goodness in our lives. We make our way prosperous through obedience because when we do what he asks us to do, we strengthen our connection with the source of life. The more completely our lives are in agreement with God, the more his nature and kingdom manifest in us. Radical obedience, because it's a matter of relationship, is always a heart issue. Thus, keeping the testimony, the key to radical obedience, is designed first to do something in our hearts. Moses told the people, "Only take heed to yourself and diligently keep yourself, lest you forget the things that your eyes have seen, and lest they depart from your heart all the days of your life." Deuteronomy 4:9. Later Solomon said, keep your heart with all diligence, for out of it spring the issues of life. Proverbs 4:23. Whatever fills our hearts will fill our thinking and our behavior. When we keep the testimony, we fill our hearts with truth, and the truth of who God is, the truth of who we are, and the truth of where we've come from and where we're going in God. But it is our responsibility to fill our hearts with truth, because if we don't, we will allow our hearts to be filled with the lies of the enemy. So, it's our responsibility to fill our hearts with truth. God does the miracles, we set our eyes on him. Breaking it down again, what does that actually look like in our day-to-day life? Because these are things we need to walk out. Meditating on his testimonies. Now, I think that sometimes, because we've had to translate the Bible, we just lose some of that kind of immediate discerning of what a word means. And I think that in our culture, I don't know, for the longest time when I think of meditate, I think of Eastern religion, meditating and being Zen and all those things. But this word, the Hebrew word for meditate is hagah. And it means to moan, growl, utter, muse, devise, plot, and speak. It means to speak those testimonies. Not just filing away, talking about them for a little bit. I had a conversation with someone a few weeks ago who said, I'm just learning to just keep all the good things God does in my head. Because when I speak them out, it's like a little beacon in the spirit world for the enemy to attack me. And I straight up said immediately, I'm like, that is a lie from the pit of hell. That is not truth. God says to speak our testimonies, not keep them hidden. And if we have fear, we'll deal with that heart issue of fear about speaking those out, but part of that is grabbing onto the truth. That what does our testimony do? It makes the enemy deflated. It makes him shrink in despair, and all the fight leaves him. That's the truth and the reality of what testimony does. So if there is anything in our heads that says, I need to not talk about what God is doing because then I'm going to get attacked, that's rubbish. Rubbish. Danny, speaking English. Okay. One of the things I've found personally in my life is I'm going to ask for a raise of hands here because I'm a teacher and I like people to raise their hands. But how many of you have ever had to keep a medical diary of some sort? You've had to keep a little tally of what's going on, what kind of symptoms you're having, those types of things, okay? So for the past long time, I feel I've been having to keep a bit of a medical diary. And I started by just putting in the days where I had symptoms, where things kind of popped up in my body that shouldn't be there. But I slowly evolved, not even really consciously doing it, and now I intentionally do it, but I write down every day where I have no symptoms. And I write down every day where I only have a little bit of symptoms and I have most of the day good. And what I have noticed that it's doing in my mind is that when I go on my phone, because I keep it in my phone, and I go through to scroll to see kind of gauge where I'm at, I can see, wow, I just went 12 days symptom-free. And it has become a testimony of God's goodness and his breakthrough in my life rather than looking at it and only seeing negative. So that's just a simple one that I've done, and it's like it radically changes my mind, and I am so excited to get to the next day and write in another day of breakthrough. And on the days where I don't have breakthrough and things happen, I can be like, I trust you, Jesus. I get it. I want this to be gone forever, but I trust you. in the midst of this because I know that you're good. We need to get into community. Wouldn't be Monique up here if we weren't talking about community. But I love community. One person's testimonies are awesome. But when you get into community, it multiplies. And you get to have your faith built on everybody's testimonies. And so we need to talk about them. I get that testimonies are often birthed in some of the messiest parts of our lives, because we typically don't need miracles where things are going fabulous. But we need miracles, we need God to show up and bring breakthrough in the messy parts of our lives, whether it's a health condition, whether it's a financial situation, whether it's a marriage that's falling apart. God shows up in these messy situations. And I get that that can sometimes make us hesitate to share those testimonies, because then we kind of got to own up to and acknowledge that messy part of our life in front of other people. But there's so much power in the testimony. And we need to realize that everybody has mess. Everybody has struggles. And you don't know if you speaking your testimony is going to release breakthrough for somebody else. You don't know that. And so when we keep those testimonies on lockdown, we're robbing the body of Christ. We need to open that up. I don't mean you need to share every gory detail, but we need to share what God is doing. I'd be remiss if I didn't mention the Word of God, okay? That's something we obviously need to meditate on. It's full of testimony. Sometimes we freak out and we're like, I'm not hearing God. He's not speaking to me. Well, he's always speaking through his word, so we don't really have an excuse. He's always speaking through the word. Another practical thing that I've learned to do is to seek out testimonies. And so because that word means to do again, I want to know the stories of when he's done it in the first place. So, for example, one of my friends, a few years ago, her daughter was diagnosed with cystic fibrosis. And as a family, we wanted to commit to pray for her daughter for a total healing of that disease. And the first thing I did was I scoured the internet to find a testimony of someone who was miraculously healed of cystic fibrosis. And I found it in like 5 minutes. So I didn't really scour. I Googled, okay? But the fact is, I found a testimony of a guy who had cystic fibrosis his whole life. He went to college, his parents had been praying, they had been praying for him in his church, and then all of a sudden he started not taking his meds, and he was okay. And all these changes started to happen, and he went to a new doctor, and she's like, I don't understand why you're here. And he's like, well, I have cystic fibrosis. And she tested him over again, and all traces of the disease left his body. So because I could look at that testimony and be like, see, you did it, God. You already did it, and you're going to do it again. And I could use that testimony to build my faith. Lastly, our worship is so instrumental. That was not meant to be punny, but it kind of was. I'm a poet and I didn't even know it. Worship songs I like to think of them as they're like modern day psalms. They're written out of people's experiences with God. They're testimonies set to music. And when we join in and we sing that and we declare those things, we are actually, in fact, meditating on testimony. I have been really privileged to see a friend write a song recently and know the story that went behind it. And man, that song was powerful when I know the testimony that goes behind it. I don't want to be a whistleblower here, but there's some of the songs we sing on Sunday that are written by members of this church. And I love that. I love that we sing out and we declare those testimonies of people in this body. All of that is going to build our faith. Faith isn't something that we need to strive for or conjure up. It's something that just builds naturally when we set our eyes on Jesus, when we see what he's done. I can't help but have my faith grow when I see the miraculous, when I see God's provision, when I see God set somebody free. It just grows. So really our work then, if you want to call it work, is to go after the testimonies, because your faith is just going to grow. It's just a natural byproduct. I already think that this church, we place a high value on testimony. Absolutely. I wanted to dig a little bit more deeper into it this morning, so that we could really see how that can play out in our lives even more. I really think that the way that God has set that up, that if we keep our eyes on testimony, that is a part of us rooting in. And we are digging into what God has for us, and it's those streams of living water that are never going to run dry for us. And so just like the Israelites, he had told them, meditate on the law. And he set the ark before them to go everywhere that they went. I think when we do that, we're going to look like Psalm 1, verses 3. And he will be like a tree firmly planted and fed by streams of water, which yields its fruit in its season. Its leaf does not wither, and in whatever he does, he prospers and comes to maturity. That's what digging in and rooting in looks like. We look like big old trees planted by streams of water. And I'm really excited about that. This morning, I asked Nicole if I could share this, because when I was signing Hannah in, and she's in the nursery this morning, she said she came in hobbling into church. Her back was so sore. And she was like, okay, I got time to find someone to pray for me before we've got all these kids. So she headed downstairs to see if someone could pray for her. And she went down the stairs, and as she was going down the stairs, all her pain started to leave. She didn't even get to ask for prayer. Her daughter interrupted her, and she went back upstairs, and she's like, pain is virtually gone. God is so cool. Just by walking down the stairs, walking into the building, getting healed. Okay? I'm going to have Perry come up now and share a really cool testimony. And then after that, we're going to get into some ministry time. And I'm excited to just unleash these testimonies on our church body. And we're going to see God do really cool stuff. So I invite Perry on up here.
Thanks. I need some insurance. Just in case. Whoops. So I've been really blessed. Here we go. I told you I needed it. By Kathleen's testimony. Something amazing has happened to her, and I'm sure a lot of you have heard about it. And I just felt that I needed to talk to her after the service there last Sunday and just tell her how blessed I was to hear about it. So to me, this morning, testimony isn't about me this morning, but it's to edify me. It's not to edify me, sorry. It's to edify the church, because it already happened to me. It already happened to Kathleen. So we wanted to express that after it happened, saying, the Lord is good. It's awesome. So you'll have to bear with me a little bit, because I don't know, my brain was all over the place this morning thinking about what I was going to say, because I'm kind of an off-the-cuff guy. So this morning, my wife and I went to Tim Hortons, and we had breakfast together. And I don't know if most of you probably aren't my Facebook friends here, but some of you are. And Roll Up the Rim is on right now, and I've kind of had a little Facebook meme going on saying that, I think I'm 1 in 26 for winning a coffee. So it's pretty bad. It was actually to the point where I wanted to see how long I could go before I could win, because I didn't want to win now. So this morning I was thinking of when I was going to roll up the rim after I was done my coffee, I was like, man, this could be my testimony this morning. If I win a coffee, I could go up, I could bring it up here and I could show everybody I actually won. So anyway, that's not the way I'm up here, the reason why I'm up here this morning. But I did want to share something that happened to me in the last little bit here. And as Monique was speaking this morning, and actually before the service this morning, Monique and I had spoken about this, about me coming up here this morning. And I just phoned her, and actually I phoned the pastor first and asked him if it was okay and if he thought it was all right. And he said, talk to Monique. And so I did. I phoned her up and I said, this is what I want to do. And she just says, that's so cool, because I'm talking on testimony this morning. So it was really, I wish you could have been with me this last week so that you would know what has gone on, and you know this, like this really happened. So it's not the biggest deal in the world, but it is a testimony. And because of where the pastor is going this year, he says that this is a year that he felt that it was a year of breakout for people. The way that we've been declaring over our tithes, and not only our financial stuff, but just who we are as a people for 2017, what we can expect in 2017, where we want to go in 2017 and into the future. I think we can get very specific with it, and I think that we should get specific with it, and I think that we don't ask God enough for his help in that. I think we should take his principles and apply them to every part of our life, and as those things happen, we get to come up here and share our testimonies, because they do become fruitful. So I really believe that the things that Monique brought up this morning were just really a testimony to me, because I was sitting there going, wow, like this is so cool, because it just ties into all what I'm thinking about and what I'm going through. And I think that collectively, as everybody is here together as a congregation, and we do share these testimonies, then we can all attest to them. We can all say, well, I can have that, well, I can have that, well, I can have that, and I believe that. I'm not anybody special. I just decided to give my life to the Lord, and I just told him, you drive, and I'll sit in the back seat, and wherever you want to go, I'm going to go with you. So that brings me to part of my business world. Is I'm a consultant in the oil field, and as you know, since about November 2014, the oil field took a downturn, and so did work in the oil field, as you know. So it's been a little bit of a struggle as a consultant, because you can get a job and then all of a sudden you finish that job and it could be a few weeks before you get another one. Well, that was stretched out quite a bit in the last couple of years, so it's been a little bit of a challenge. Not only that, I started an oil field tank rental business, and which is really conducive on drilling, and I started up in 2013, and in 2014 oil crashed. Just near the end of 2014, about November, is when people started panicking. It was about $70 a barrel at that point, and honestly, today $70 a barrel sounds really good. So, but the oil companies weren't ready for that crash. They were spending lots of money. There was lots going on. There was a lot of money out and that kind of thing. So anyway, through this, in November, when things were starting to crash, I was actually buying more tanks. So it's really weird in my mind, because I'm sitting there going, okay, oil's crashing, and I'm buying some tanks. Like, what's wrong with me here? So I just prayed about it, and I got a call. This company wanted more tanks, and the oil's crashed. I'm thinking, what am I doing? Like, I can't buy more tanks. Like, this is not good, right? I could go under here. So I just stopped and I prayed about it, and I said, Lord, it's your business. I started this with a vision of you being in mind with it, and wherever you want to take it, you just go with it. So I just felt that I needed to buy some more tanks. So I did, and through that time, I was in there long enough that I was able to pay off my tanks, and I was able to weather the storm. I was able to pay off debts that I owed, and then all of a sudden 2016 came, and it still wasn't busy yet. Mostly everybody thought that it was going to be about an 8-month thing, but that's from November to September would start picking back up again, and life would be great, and the oil field would be going again. Well, that never happened. And as you know, the drilling rigs, there was, people were moving away, and the housing market went down, and the downturn in the oil came. So anyway, at that point, I was, a person could get nervous about things. A person could wonder, did I do the right thing? where am I going to go with this? How am I going to survive? These kind of things. And honestly, I never spent nights awake worrying about it because I knew it was God's business. I knew that I wanted to stand on his promises, and I wanted to, trust in him. And so I did. And so now when the pastors, here we hit 2017, the pastor's talking about this is a breakout year, and he really believes that, and I believe that with him as council. We've talked about things, and we're heading that way. In the service, we're talking about that, and the oil field's starting to pick up, and the economy is starting to go the other way. Hallelujah. So, yeah, people that weren't affected by the oil field downturn and the economy downturn, there are some jobs here that aren't affected by that. That's great, but there's lots that are. So, but anyway, so a couple weeks ago, I was like, okay, what am I going to do with this, Lord? So I started phoning up customers and people I had contacts with and new people and stuff, and everybody's like, well, no, we're not doing much, and no, we don't need your tanks, and blah, blah, blah. And there's this one guy that said he might be able to take a tank, and says, okay, I'll touch base with you later. So a couple of weeks go by. I touched base with him later, and I said, so you guys going to drill that well? And he's like, no, we're going to push it back to the third quarter. And I'm like, oh, okay. Well, now what? So it's kind of out of options. And then all this, in my mind, I was thinking this as we were going through it. And he goes, well, honestly, but I've got a bigger problem. I go, what? He goes, well, how many tanks do you have? And I told him. And he said, well, I need them all. And I was like, what? He says, yeah, I think I need them all. He says, if you can give me a quote, give me a price on your tanks for a certain amount of time, give him your bottom dollar, and he says, maybe we can make it happen. So he needs them over road bounds. So what's the deal is road bounds come on every spring. It gets nicer out, the roads thaw, and you can't run heavy equipment on them. So I need to get my tanks out before road bound, or else it's going to be May, June before I'm even hoping to get them out again. So basically I just prayed about it and said, okay, Lord, this is your business. What do you want to do? So I started typing an email out, and I put my prices in, and I was just going to hit send, and I said, okay, Lord, this is all up to you. Am I doing this right? And I still didn't know 100%. I had to go a little bit on faith, obviously, right? So I hit send. Next thing you know, it wasn't even like, I don't know, a couple hours, he calls me back, and he goes, yeah, it's 99% sure we're good, but can you just slash the price a little bit more? And I'm like, oh my goodness. I said, oh, whatever. So I just prayed about it quickly. I just gave him just a wee little discount for the second month, and hit send, and next thing you know, I got my tanks out. So it's not for me this morning, like I said. I'm not boasting this morning. It's just to let you know that I applied some of the things that God has promised us, some of the things that we rely on. Lord, we pray about things, and we ask that these things will happen. I'm telling you that it happened to me. So this morning, I want to bless other people that way too, to tell you it's not just for me, it's not just for Kathleen, it's for all of us. And I just wanted to encourage you this morning for that.